when I hear you frame it in that way, the right to innovate, for me, it's tantamount to the right to live. I am obligated to hack solutions to seemingly intractable problems. And the biggest problem in America, as Du Bois said centuries ago, is the color line.
Hmm.
And so for me, it is a reminder, it's a declaration, it's a beseechment for us to live and thrive in spite of.
Ever wonder what it takes to unlock true Black innovation and wealth creation? You're in the right place.
This is From Chains to Links, where the brightest Black minds, entrepreneurs, academics, creatives, and futurists reimagine what it means to build generational wealth and a thriving Black community.
We're not just talking about change, we're building it. Stick around because this conversation is about to spark something different. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of From Chains to Links. I am your co-host, Kelly Burton, and I am here with Ify and Kelly. Hey girl.
Hey,
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a beautiful day.
It is a beautiful day.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on in politics. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But in spite of the politics, I'm blessed. I'm blessed. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there. It's an interesting week. I committed this week to just staying present and like keeping my head on the swivel, like spiritually, like what's going on? What's going on? What's going on?
Observant.
Just staying, yeah, because I'm just being reminded that we fighting up against powers and principalities out here.
Come on.
And sometimes I tend to get a little too comfortable, and sometimes I just gotta be like, no, baby.
Yeah.
Stay woke.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Stay woke.
And on that, I think we should introduce our guest in the space, Mr. Teach the Babies himself, Dr. David Johns, Long Beach native all day, triple Columbia grad. Am I saying this correctly?
Yeah. Inglewood, the cousin, but I keep going.
Okay. And always the executive director of NBJC, National Black Justice Coalition. And I know all about NBJC, but I want you to kind of let us know a little bit about it. Obviously, and of course, welcome. So introduce yourself in this space. Tell us a little bit about NBJC, and especially at this moment, why we need to know about who NBJC is.
Oh, absolutely. So NBJC is a 21-year-old civil rights organization that has always been intentional and unapologetic in acknowledging the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA plus equality. We typically show up in legacy civil rights spaces, think NAACP, National Urban League, the greatest fraternity known to man, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, and remind African folks that a symptom of white supremacy is that we forget that African people are queer, right? That in this country, queerness has become a synonym of sexual minorities, but the ontological origins of the word queer simply means that which is not in a pejorative position of power. So if you're not a white, cis, heterosexual man, you are queer. If you're a person with a disability, you are queer. As women in a society based on patriarchy, y'all are queer. And we remind folks, the fatal hammer of it all, none of us are free unless and until all of us are free. We then show up in progressive, read white LGBTQ spaces, think HRC, GLSEN, organizations like that. And it's interesting, I named those two because for the first time in the history of those organizations, they're led by Black leaders who love Black people. HRC, slightly different. There was a Black man before Kelly Robinson is the president now. That's not the point. The point is that we often show up in those spaces reminding white queer people that they have privilege that can often be used to harm us in ways that they don't acknowledge. But the goal is to make sure that we can all get free.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I think there's so many different places we can go in this conversation. It feels like when it comes to the Black political experience, we're at a bit of an inflection point in light of the fact that Vice President Harris is the candidate for the Democrats. In light of, I think about even the Zoom call, like the Black woman initiated, which created a whole new fundraising model.
Shout out to Joteka Edie.
Shout out to Joteka. We're just leading in these spaces in a different kind of a way, and it's almost like we got a little edge to it. I'm curious if you feel the inflection point, or maybe it's an iteration of something that's always kind of been.
I think it's probably C, all of the above,
Yeah.
right? What I know, and this goes back to the invitation to talk about why MBJC is most relevant now, I would argue that it's always been relevant in part because queer folks, sexual minorities, femme-identified Black women have always lived on the front lines of efforts to get us closer to freedom. Often in June, people engage in pride pimping and rainbow parades without acknowledging that if it weren't for a Black woman, Marsha Payne Oman Johnson, who resisted righteously both laws that were targeting queer people in New York, that said if you wore pants like mine, you could go to jail, that said that if people assumed that or knew that I was queer, they could deny me liquor. That's why we were forced to go to Stonewall. And it was a Black woman in that space where the police would then offer up additional abuse. We know that they're there. They shouldn't be there. Let's go and take advantage of it. Marsha was like, oh, fuck that. We ain't gonna do it. Not on tonight. And then started a whole organization that contributed to what a lot of people now talk about as the LGBTQ movement. We typically celebrate the anniversary of the March on Washington without acknowledging that it was a Black queer man, Bayard Rustin, who was forced by people who he worked in spite of their efforts to destroy and derail that plan. He did that in 2 months in spite of everybody's desire to try and tear that down. That was a Black queer man. And so what I know is two things. I look forward to the day when people are not required to invite in.
Yes.
I don't use the word coming out in part because the way that privilege works, straight people stand with their arms folded and wait for queer people to tell a story about when we realized we were different or weird. And my reality is I've always known I've had superpowers.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that information isn't owed to anybody, especially in a space when I can be offered up for additional forms of harm. But if we can do this and we can build, and I trust you, I can invite you in. The other thing is that the way that stigma works, sexual minorities are seen as like the worst pariahs, when reality is that all of us have something that society says we should feel shame around. So let's normalize that, and we can invite people in. I look forward to the day when people are not required to come out, because the reality is that who I love and how I identify should not define me in the ways that politics allows it to define people in this moment. Unpack this in two ways. We exist in a point now, and to your point about inflections, where people think that cisgender is a slur. It's a biological term. Cisgender simply means that when a doctor assigns your gender at birth, because that's how it works, doctors make educated guesses. If you agree with that assignment when you're old enough to understand who you are in this world that you didn't ask to be invited into, then you're cisgender. If you don't, you're transgender. That's all those terms mean. But they have been politicized in a way that have people thinking that it is a slur. And people then use that stigma to drive wedge political issues that are all about dividing and conquering so that people in unearned positions of power can maintain them. Just a real long way of saying that, like, I am aware of all of these dynamics. And for me, that more Black women like Joteka are getting credit for their work is not new. The reality is that Joteka has been organizing those calls every Sunday for 4 years.
Yes.
I've been most frustrated by the media attention that suggested that it's magic that isn't backed up by consistent labor and organizing, right? Like, that's a skill that other people are now coming and benefiting from. White dudes, I was on a call with Black men the day after, queer men the day after that, right? Dogs, cats. But that was built on the backs of Black women.
Yes.
And that's just how this country does.
And if I could just add to, like, make a little bit of a arc between what you were raising around this inviting in and what we're seeing visibly as to what's happening with Vice President Kamala Harris, right? The questioning.
Can I say I appreciate that every time y'all say Vice President, put the respect on it. Of course, y'all are Black women, so y'all gonna do it. But I be mad when people call her like by her first name as if they know her. Like, you don't know that woman like that.
And the crazy thing is, like, I've met her, and I actually, and then it's like you
have
know her, right? But
right.
it's like, you're absolutely right. For the purposes of this publication, at least the first time that you mention somebody, shout out to Chicago AP, you give them their title, right, as they're moving. But Vice President Kamala Harris is being forced to be not to share the depth of who she is and why that informs her politics. but she's being forced into this harmful politics narrative. And there's a fine line between the two. But I find, especially as we are talking about the bridge between, or this podcast is in many ways around the politics of innovation, right? Is that those who are often on the outskirts, and I'm thinking very much around, you know, from the margin to the center, and Bell Hooks' theory about things, right? About what it means to, out of necessity, need to create new theories, new philosophies, but also at times learning how to just be, even when people are trying to agitate you into outing, or to jumping into their versions of outing yourself, right? I appreciate the way Vice President Harris is holding her own, not because at least for me, I'm not convinced that any of it is about shame. I'm seeing it as like, you are trying to lure me into a conversation that is ultimately going to have a debate of who I am, right? And one of the things that I think is troubling around the politics of this, you know, quote unquote aftermath of D&I and the affirmative action Supreme Court case is that we so easily, sometimes I sit and you know the type of work that I do, and sometimes I sit and wonder, did people even really fully buy into this to begin with? Because the quickness,
the DE&I of it all,
correct, and I don't, regardless of what I label it, that's what majority people
that's right.
understand it as. But the quickness by which people have so turned makes me wonder if people really think about the violence that is inflicted, not just with silence, but the violence that happens when there's this, like, even in the most benign way of framing it, that like, to be safe, we're not going to talk anymore about this. Or the flip side, if you want this funding, if you want this money, tell me all about your journey. Tell me all about trauma, right? All the trauma that is presented. So that was just the arc that I felt like, as you were talking, oftentimes when people hear, if I can be very honest, from queer advocates, they like to feel like, oh, well, I'm not queer, so I can't relate. But it's like, but if you listen to the experiences and recognize that, like, oh, wait a minute, I do know what it's like when I'm being forced to share something about something I actually care about.
That's right.
But it's being forced to, I'm being forced to see if I'm gonna jump rope with somebody that doesn't even share my interests, let alone know what I know, or know what I've
don't know
through.
How to turn on time. Right. So
not the jump rope reference.
Right. 3 things that I got excited about. One, part of why I started and declined to use a Latin term, but define queer in that way, was to make that connection easier for people to make. Right. When you are when you allow yourself to believe that your proximity to privilege or whiteness is going to protect you, you can then distance yourself from people and convince yourself that your liberation is not bound up by theirs. So NBJC this year worked in partnership with 5 other national organizations led by Black queer people who love Black people. HRC, the LGBTQ Task Force, GLSEN, Family Equality, NCLR, the National, did I say that? Did I say National Center for Lesbian Rights? I want to make sure I say give them all the respect they deserve. But we decided to collect some data. One, because I wanted to turn down white noise. Literally, I got so frustrated going into meetings where white people are crying and acting like the sky's falling down for the first time ever. Literally, I was at a conference and was like, can I play a video of Fannie Lou Hamer reminding us that we are equipped to win in this moment? And she did that after all kind of trauma at the hands of the state. And literally just started asking, how different could we manage these moments and meetings if white people would just shut up for a second? That's one part. The other part was, what I know is that there's often no daylight between what Black people who are sexual minorities or who have a disability and people who don't want. And so we now have data that makes it plain that there is literally no difference in the way that Black LGBTQIA plus folks, sometimes you'll hear me say trans, queer, and gender expansive. I use gender expansive in the place where people typically use gender non-conforming or non-binary. Gender expansive gets us away from the binary that we're actually trying to get away from. So that's why that language is there. But what we know is that the policy priorities are the same. Number one is healthcare. Number 2, cost and inflation. The cost of everything is too damn high, including drugs and rent. Right? 3, safety, police reform, justice, equity. Those are the things that we're all fighting for. And the other part, and this is why I did it backwards, is that Black people also understand shared fate, our linked fate. The idea that what happens to one of us affects all of us.
Yeah.
And it might take me helping somebody appreciate that by highlighting how stereotypes about migrant communities affect job opportunities and housing options and the like, to then make the parallel for folks who are like, well, I don't understand that queer stuff. You do know the sting of stigma and the damage of discrimination. So if we need to find new language in order to appreciate these commonalities, let's do that. And now we have data to back it up, to remind folks again that like some of this is about us engaging in what my friend CC Battle calls white supremacy rehab and reclaiming African ways. Was she here earlier?
Yeah,
of course she was. But reclaiming African ways of being so that we don't have to be mired in all of this bullshit, so that we can actually move in a different way, so that we don't have to even entertain these questions about jumping double dutch with niggas that don't know how to turn.
Love it.
You said something about you're bringing together Black queer organizations who love Black people.
Yeah.
Kelly, I knew Kelly was going to harp on that. The ... who love Black people is like Kelly.
I know, but I'm going a different direction. Even though I am. And what kind of quickened in my spirit is, how do Black people love queer Black people? Like, and it sounds like obvious, but I feel a deep, as a person who acknowledges that I have my own gaps in understanding and knowledge. Sometimes I don't even want to get to the understanding. I just want to love on you, and create space and be present. And so even as a leader and as an individual, I'm curious as your thoughts about how do Black folks love on queer Black folks, create space for queer Black folks in ways that are intentional in light of what you share. What we want is the same. Largely, I'm sure that there's some nuance, but in my growth, in my development, I would like to move into my own leadership, being more thoughtful about how I love on folks who may have a different experience.
And really quickly, Kelly, just as somebody who doesn't talk necessarily in the space of, I don't want to say of ownership of like my queerness, but identifies and understands that, because it's almost like the minority of the minority. Like, I'm demisexual. It's like, what is that? But nobody knows what that is. But at the same token, when you say that, this is what sometimes it sounds like to me. I love you, so why we got to talk about that? And I'm not saying that that's you. I'm saying that I feel like there's a space where it's like, to your point, it's like, I don't want nobody killed. I don't want nobody hurt. And also, what I always question is there a spaciousness to also say that like there are areas of Black that we don't know about. And sometimes the stories we inherit is that we are all Black the same. Or like there's this Black, what I like to say when I'm teaching to my students is like, Black History Month is often Black Male History Month, but we don't say it like that. So even as femme folk, we can't rattle off like the top 10 Black women that have like, were lawbreakers, or the last 10 Black women that were killed by police, right? So we also normalize certain things. So I'm not saying it's you, but I am curious though, is it the feeling that like, this is too much for me and I don't want to really talk about it? Or is it the feeling of like, do I have enough time? Like, what space needs to be created for me to kind of like understand another layer of Blackness, which I know you personally, so I can answer that. But I feel like sometimes the way it feels, it's like, and if I can be honest, with the civil rights organizations that we've worked with, a lot of them do happen to be led by Black male leaders. And when queer issues or femme issues get brought up, the response often is, but you're Black first. And that almost always, the other parts of me just feel like, whoa, when you kind of just get put in the corner, it's almost like you got sunned in the corner to be like, okay, I guess that's the most important.
No, I appreciate the follow-up question. What I'll say is, for me personally, I'm very cerebral. So I'll lead with, I want to understand. Explain it to me. But then I'm reminded, sometimes you just got to lead with your heart.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and
I
say,
love
I love
that.
you first.
I
I
love
mean,
that.
I'm open to understanding as much as you want to tell me, and I want to hear.
Yeah.
But if the starting point from me is, I love you.
I love that.
And what does that look like for you? Like, how do you need to be loved?
I love that. Let me try and weave this together. When I worked for still my president, Barack Hussein Obama, his fabulous wife, Michelle Yvonne Robinson Obama, Sasha Malia, Grandma Robinson, rest in peace, the dogs Sonny and Bo, who were gifted to them by my previous boss, Ted Kennedy. One of the things that I was most proud of in having led an initiative focused on educational excellence for African Americans, established by Barack Hussein Obama, was that we disrupted this habit that adults have of talking about students, solving problems for students, without ever engaging students in conversations about what they're doing, what they want, and what they need support with. So we partnered with Ebony Magazine, Johnson Publishing Company, and produced these AFAMED summits around the country at colleges and universities, and then with communities. Some of the organizations that we're naming, we worked in partnership with, but we asked every student that we met, hundreds of thousands of students across the country, kindergarten all the way through college age, non-traditional included, what is the one thing you need in order to thrive? And typically when I do keynotes, I'll ask, what do you think was offered up most frequently? But the answer was love. And the beautiful thing about that is that when people would offer up other words, I'm like, that whatever you offered up is anchored by love. So what I do know is that that is a powerful anecdote to white supremacy and all of its cousins. That's one. The second thing is to your naming of hierarchies. This is why I appreciated you bringing into the room bell hooks, lowercase b, lowercase h earlier, because it's Black feminists that help us appreciate how all of this stuff works. They give us terms like the matrix of domination, the signs, systems, and symbols that allow white supremacy, homophobia, transmisogynoir, all of these things to be omnipresent and hyper invisible at the same damn time. Such that when somebody rolls up on you with some white supremacy, we don't even have the language or space to unpack it, right? We're often forced to make these kinds of decisions or default to these kinds of behaviors in ways that are all about preserving white supremacy. Specific to a part of the question I heard is like, what to do? I'll give you the answer that my babies gave me. So when the previous occupant of the Oval Office made it impossible for me to stay in public service, I went back to school, my third tour of duty at Columbia University, and I wanted to focus my dissertation on the experiences of Black LGBTQIA+ middle and high school students throughout this country. That was important for me because in the decade career that I had on Capitol Hill, often as the only and one of the highest ranking policy advisors, I worked on the Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, for Ted Kennedy till he died, God rest his soul, then Tom Harkin thereafter. In all of the time that I was in that space, whenever organizations, NAACP, Urban League, and the like, advocated for the needs of Black students, there was an assumption that everybody was cisgendered and heterosexual, which is a lie from the pit of white supremacy. Conversely, when GLSEN, HRC, those organizations, then led by white folks, came to advocate, all of the materials, the people they brought with them were white, or as adjacent as they could be. And so when those dynamics exist, it's easy for people to lie to themselves and say, oh, we don't have y'all here. And it's even easier for people to do that and feel righteous when they don't have access to African ways of knowing. So this is me being like, Sambufu Some writes a book, The Spirit of Intimacy, and what they write in chapter 13, which is titled Homosexuality, the Gatekeepers, is in my village in West Africa, the words lesbian and gay didn't exist, but the word gatekeeper did. So for me, it's when I'm talking to folks who, again, caught up in the white supremacy of it all, is we as a community, Black folks, hold space for Native and Indigenous folks who celebrate two-spirited individuals. If everything began in Africa, that shit did not just skip us. So let's spend a little bit more time unpacking that. So that was the context. I'm in school, Audre Lorde, using the master's tools to dismantle all of the houses that we built for free. And I am engaged in conversation with babies who policy and research suggest don't even exist. Right? The 5 largest national data sets that fund or support the funding of education don't ask kids questions about their sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. When that comes up, it's usually in a health context and it's around risk, HIV. Right? So I'm now creating data because if you don't have it, often they say it's not real or it doesn't exist. And it's a mixed method study because I got to use y'all's quantitative data and then add a little bit of qualitative flavor. But here are the 3 findings that are most significant from this study. And I just want to say thank you to all of my babies. One is that age is significant. Age is significant. Too often we are trained to hold important conversations until we think people are ready. This is in part why Moms for Liberty, an organization, many of whom don't have kids in public schools anyway, has been attacking democracy by attacking schools and suggesting that we ban books that feature our stories and this language, and remind folks that like the beautiful diversity that exists now is how we will continue to strive as a democracy. My babies, age is significant. We say, wait until they get to high school, then we'll talk to them about it. So one of my babies said, well, I got called a faggot in the 3rd grade. It wasn't until I was in high school that I understood what that meant, but I knew that it hurt. I knew that it hurt. And what I know as somebody that taught kindergarten is that children are often able to have thoughtful, complex conversations in ways that adults can't. In ways that adults can't, because we get caught up in the politics of it all and the politics and the bullshit. But age is significant. We have to appreciate that, as Tom Harkin would say, learning begins at birth and the preparation for learning starts well before birth. So it's about holding space for appreciating development and having more meaningful conversations with babies before we think they're ready. That's one. The second is that mental health support is critically important. So to that point, like, what do you do when you're carrying trauma, but you don't have the language to name it? Are tools to deal with it. And you're forced to go to schools that have policies that make it such that for every 1 white boy suspended or expelled in K through 12th grade, the rate is 3 times higher for Black boys. The rate is 6 times higher for Black girls. The suicide rate for Black youth has doubled in the last 2 decades. And based on a limited data that we have, some of which I collected, we know that students who, here's the thing, because they're babies, students who are often assumed to be trans, queer, and gender expansive because they don't perform gender in the way in which they're expected to, those babies face additional challenges and threats. And often those who need it the most are the furthest away from the likelihood of getting it. Related to that, what I appreciated about the mixed methods approach, otherwise I wouldn't have found it, is that for trans students in particular, Aretha was right, respect matters. Also not surprising to anybody who's thoughtful, right? Like, I don't care what you know until I know that you care about me. But this is important at a moment when you have people like the failed history teacher turned governor of Florida creating police departments to arrest teachers who might have a sticker from an organization like NBJC or HRC in their room to signal a show of support, right? Like that's the space that we're in now. While I'm here, the most surprising finding for me was colorism, as was named by my participants, is incredibly toxic, and too often we don't talk about it. And I'm blaming Bravo for being problematic in this regard in this moment. They named Black women as a significant resource, and all of those babies were also aware of the tax that Black women have to play in order to hold space and show and be supportive. And then the last thing is around one's ability to name their own experience. It's a Toni Morrison of it all. So in this moment where adults are, who don't care about grammar otherwise, are arguing about they, them, and theirs, in a world where there are laws that have been passed that require teachers to out children who might use a different name than the one that's on their birth certificate. Here's what I think about oftentimes, like, as a kindergarten teacher, in a moment when I were like 30% of trans youth 13 through 17 live in a state where they are prohibited from using a bathroom of their choice. As long as those kids weren't peeing on my rug, I didn't give a fuck. Right?
Yes.
And I remember my mother got caught up in all of this manufactured bullshit some time ago, and I said to her, your bathroom is an inclusive bathroom.
That's right.
Right? Like, people make these decisions that lead to that create space for politicians to pass laws that are problems in search of solutions in search of a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, if a kid wanted me to call them Batman on Tuesday, call them Batman.
I'm so grateful for this conversation for so many reasons, and I'm so sad that we're having to wrap it up. We've got one last question to kind of close us out.
Yeah, I definitely feel like we need to continue to do the deep dive on this, especially since, before we started the show, we found out that Fearless Fund had to officially now close their program, which means that discrimination lawsuit is now officially done.
Yep.
And shout out to Arian and all them for daring to fight that fight, because that is an expensive fight.
Literally and figuratively.
Yeah,
my prayers that they also have a solid mental health team.
Exactly. And where does that leave so many other spaces? So we are moving in this space of, Black people have always had challenges, but we've never stopped innovating. And we are owning the concept of like innovation is our birthright. And the shortened version of that is that we have the right to innovate. So when you hear right to innovate, what does that bring to your mind? What are your thoughts around that? What does that mean for you? And like that good 60-second sizzle reel.
Oh, Jesus. When I hear you frame it in that way, the right to innovate, for me, it's tantamount to the right to live. I am obligated to hack solutions to seemingly intractable problems. And the biggest problem in America, as Du Bois said centuries ago, is the color line. And so for me, it is a reminder, it's a declaration, it's a beseechment for us to live and thrive in spite of.
Thank you, David.
Beautiful. Thank you, David.
Thank you. This was good.
Thank you for all you do and
Seriously.
all you mean and all you model.
My duty and my honor. Thank you.
Deep gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us for another episode of From Chains to Links. We're so excited to continue these conversations. In some ways, I feel we're just scratching the surface, but yes. But these are conversations that need to be had, and we're going to keep having them. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for riding with us on today's journey. If this episode hit home, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend.
Visit FromChainsToLinks.com for more content, and make sure to subscribe on our YouTube.
Follow us on Instagram at @BuildWithBIA, and let's keep this movement growing.
The road to true Black prosperity is built together, and we need you to do it.